Rocky Mountain Construction, or RMC, has rapidly become one of the most important roller coaster manufacturers in the world, and it's fair to say that their innovations have revolutionised the roller coaster industry and left other well-established manufacturers having to play catch-up. To date, they've opened 13 hybrid coasters, 4 wooden coasters, and also created a unique single rail model. All these coasters have been a huge success for the respective parks, and I consider myself very lucky to have been able to ride every single one of them. I'm Rollercoaster David, and this is my journey to riding every RMC. Now, riding every one of RMC's coasters may not sound all that impressive, as there's only 18 unique models currently open, but in all honesty, there are probably only a handful of people in the world that can claim to have done the same thing. Achieving this requires quite the journey, spanning 3 continents, 5 countries, and it's taken me a total of about 5 years to manage this. So how did I end up riding all the RMCs in the world? What spites did I face along the way? And which one of these amazing coasters is the best? Let's find out as my journey begins. Now strangely, I didn't even realise it when I rode my first roller coaster that was constructed by RMC, and that's because the first RMC I rode was an Intamed. El Toro at Six Flags Great Adventure is to this day my favourite wooden roller coaster, and whilst it was designed by Intamed, it was actually built by RMC. This was long before the company had started designing their own roller coasters, but it does make me wonder if they were taking notes during the construction, as the strong injector airtime you find in El Toro is very similar to that you can get on RMC's original creations. The first time I rode an original RMC, however, was back in 2014, when I rode their first ever hybrid coaster, the new Texas Giant at Six Flags Over Texas. This coaster had opened just 3 years previously, and I'd heard great things about it. Unfortunately, that was somewhat overshadowed by a tragic accident in 2013, when a woman lost her life after being thrown from one of the trains, but I'd been following that incident closely, and had faith in the new safety procedures and adjustments that had been made since then, so I still felt perfectly safe while riding. Now back then I would probably consider myself still relatively inexperienced as a roller coaster enthusiast, but thankfully this is a coaster that lived up to the hype that I'd heard about it, and delivered an amazing ride. The new Texas Giant is packed with airtime, and whilst in comparison to more modern RMCs, its layout could probably be considered quite restrained, it was very innovative for the time, with some really fun twisty sections that made it feel unlike any other coaster I'd ridden. From memory, I think this was a coaster that was best in the back seat, as the way you're pulled through some of the overbanks and the section after the mid-course brake run are much more fun and snappy in the back. My memories of other RMCs that I've ridden more recently are much more vivid, however, so I've got more to say about them, but Six Flags Over Texas is still high on my list of parks that I want to revisit, as the Texas Giant was great fun and I'd love to ride it again. Later in 2014, I would also experience my first RMC wooden coaster, the brand new record-breaking Goliath at Six Flags Great America. This would end up being quite a pivotal moment for me in my roller coaster riding history, as it would also be the first time I'd encounter RMC's signature zero-G stall element, which would rapidly become one of my favourite bits of roller coaster design. Goliath had only recently opened when I rode it, and it was super smooth, and its drop of 180 feet was the tallest and steepest drop of any wooden roller coaster in the world, plus in addition to that it had 2 inversions. That zero-G stall though is something really worth raving about. As a first-time rider experiencing it, it just felt so strange. Somehow you were having sustained floater airtime as if you were going over a regular airtime hill, but you were also upside down. It was almost like the physics didn't make any sense to me, and how this ride produced those sensations were a complete mystery. The rest of the ride kept up a blistering pace as well, but therein was one of the problems of the ride. To me it was just over far too quickly, and felt a bit short as a result. After the first drop, the ride only really has 5 elements before you hit the brakes, and whilst each one of those elements is executed brilliantly, it feels like there really should be more to the ride, especially when you consider its size. It almost felt as if Six Flags had tried to save money by building the most compact coaster they could that would still tick all the boxes to break the specific world records they were after. In addition, there was another thing that I felt Goliath lacked. Despite the bulk of its track supports being made of wood, it no longer felt like a wooden coaster. It didn't have that wild, out-of-control feeling that wooden coasters have. It didn't have that flex in the track or the characteristic noise or general feeling that makes wooden coasters special, and riding it felt almost identical to riding a hybrid like the new Texas Giant. I keep wooden coasters and steel coasters quite separate in my mind, partly because that allows me to have two number ones, but also because it helps me keep track and make sense of the 900 plus coasters I've ridden to date. Most internet polls do the same and keep them separate, and whilst Goliath undoubtedly is a great coaster, I don't think it's a great example of a wooden one, so I find it quite hard to place in any list. I'd have to wait until the next year, 2015, to ride my next new RMC, and this one would again be quite different from the others, Twisted Colossus at Six Flags Magic Mountain. Twisted Colossus was built from the remains of Colossus, a signature racing wooden coaster that had been a major attraction for the park when it opened in 1978. Over the years, its popularity had waned, however, and despite trying to spice things up by running its trains backwards, it was decided that the ride had its heyday and it needed changing up. Thankfully, this would become the latest coaster to undergo the RMC treatment, and it would break records in doing so. The original Colossus was a racing wooden coaster with two separate tracks, but rather than build another traditional racing coaster, RMC instead decided to join up the two tracks into a Mobius loop, and so they created their longest hybrid coaster to date. This would mean that a single lap of the ride would take you up both sides of the lift hill, and the plan was for you to duel with a different train during each half of the course. The ride is filled with great moments where the two trains should interact, passing over or under each other, or twisting around so you see the other train when you look up above you. But unfortunately, that's not always the experience that you get. If it's operating perfectly, after dispatching, your train would meet another one on the lift hill that had already completed half of the track, and after your train reached the same track position as it, a third train would join you to duel for the second half of the ride. The problem is that unless the ride is dispatching trains in a highly efficient manner, then the ride won't duel properly, and all those carefully thought out moments of interaction will never happen. To try and compensate for variations in dispatch time, the second lift hill can be slowed down significantly to let the other train catch up, but often even this isn't enough, and each train will be going round unaccompanied. The first half of the ride is still good fun even if it's not dueling, as it's a good mix of forces and twists, but when you reach that second lift hill and it slows right down to a crawl to try and let the other train catch up, it just kills the pacing completely, and you're left being slowly dragged up a lift hill looking over at the loading station to see if there's any chance of another train joining you. The lift hill just goes so slow that if you're not immediately met by another train, it just kills off the adrenaline buzz from the first half of the ride entirely, and the whole thing suffers as a result. The second half of the ride can still be good fun even when not dueling, and the flow through elements whilst you're riding is great, but that slowdown in the middle to a snail's pace just really harms the ride overall. On rare occasions, the ride won't slow down too much on that lift hill, but more often than not you'll end up hating that second lift hill and what it does to the pacing. I don't think I've ever managed a single ride where both halves have duelled perfectly. I mean, some have come close, but often one train has been too far ahead of the other. There are occasions where I've had either the first or second half of the ride duel perfectly, but because even a slight delay caused by someone in the station fumbling with a belt or a bag can force the ride out of sync, your chances of getting a perfectly dueling ride are pretty slim. If it's running spot on, Twisted Colossus can be a fantastic ride, and the moments of interaction between the trains, such as the high five, Top Gun stall, or zero-G rollover, are all amazing, but unfortunately having that perfect ride is just so rare. Twisted Colossus would be the only new RMC I rode in 2015, as my travels took me other places in the world back then, and RMC coasters was still quite rare. 2016, however, would be the year that I would ride no less than 4 new RMCs and get badly spited by another one. It was one of the best years I've ever had for new coasters, and I made several plans for large trips. Starting out in April, I'd planned a trip that included parks all around the middle of the United States, but following advice from a friend, I tweaked those plans to end up visiting a park called Silver Dollar City to ride RMC's very first wooden coaster, Outlaw Run. Flights to anywhere nearby to Silver Dollar City proved to be either non-existent or very impractical, so what I ended up doing was flying to St. Louis and making a 4-hour drive to the park. Ironically, I ended up driving right past Six Flags St. Louis, but my friend had reliably told me that skipping it in favour of Silver Dollar City was by far the better choice. It would also mean that I'd be driving on historic Route 66, so I decided to make the most of it and do it in something special, a jet black Ford Mustang. I stopped off at a few interesting spots along the way, and the Mustang just ate up the miles, so the journey flew by, and the next day I was riding Outlaw Run. My first experience on this coaster, however, was really rather surreal. It was a slightly damp and drizzly day, and the park was very quiet, so much so that my first ride on Outlaw Run was in the back seat on an otherwise completely empty train. It was very strange to watch the rest of the train navigating the course of the track without a single other person on board, but it was a very awesome ride nonetheless. The rain did sting a bit, as the coaster goes pretty fast, reaching a top speed of 68 miles per hour, but the pacing and airtime you experience on this coaster was more than enough to distract from that. This was actually the first coaster that RMC built from the ground up, rather than using the existing skeleton of another wooden coaster, and it's got some great pacing to it. The only thing I disliked about the ride though was its length, as it's all over far too quickly. The ride was super smooth though, and the way it twists through the final two heartline rolls into the final turn is one of the best transitions you'll find on any coaster. It's just a shame it wasn't a bit longer. There was one other niggle I had with the ride though. I enjoyed Outlaw Run a lot, but just like Goliath, it lacked that wooden coaster feel and essence, and just felt like another hybrid rather than a classic woody. It's still a coaster that's well worth riding though, and I was really glad I made the trip to Silver Dollar City. It's a beautiful park, and as I had a whole day to spend there, I even got to visit their underground caves, which were truly spectacular, and far from what you'd expect from your average theme park. The next stop on the trip was Texas, where I'd revisit the new Texas Giant, but also head south to San Antonio to visit Six Flags Fiesta Texas and another RMC hybrid, Iron Rattler. There'd yet again be a significant amount of driving involved, and as I'd gotten a taste for American muscle cars, I decided to treat myself to another upgrade, this time to a convertible Camaro. Unfortunately, I soon discovered that the Camaro wasn't as practical as the Mustang, as despite the Texas heat, it wasn't possible to use the trunk for my bags and have the roof down at the same time. Fortunately, I was able to squeeze my bags into the back seat and have the roof down for a decent bit of the driving, but I do have to say that I think overall, I preferred the Mustang personally. After stopping off for some tasty Texas barbecue and a memorable night in Austin, I eventually reached San Antonio and spent my first day riding all the coasters at SeaWorld. The next day, however, would be spent at Six Flags Fiesta Texas, where I would discover my new favourite RMC. Iron Rattler is unlike any other coaster RMC have ever built, and that's mostly because of its location. Similar to the new Texas Giant, this was a conversion of an old wooden coaster called the Rattler, except rather than being built in an open flat space, that coaster was actually built on the edge of a quarry. This meant that the coaster actually dives down into the quarry off a cliff face several times, and all that rock rushing past you gives a great speed sensation. The rest of the ride has some fun twists too, and the 0G roll is simply amazing as it gives a wonderful floaty sensation as you soar high in the air. The pacing is really interesting too, as part of the way round it bounces around the top of the quarry before taking a plunge once more off the edge of a cliff. This allows it to vary its speed quite a lot during the ride, and just when you think it's slowing down, it can dive down again and go much faster. It's one of the most thrilling coasters out there, and I can't wait to go back and ride it again, not least of all because the park recently got a second RMC coaster, in the form of the single rail coaster Wonder Woman. The last leg of that particular American trip was over on the East Coast, and one of the final parks I visited was Six Flags New England, where they'd recently opened their own RMC, Wicked Cyclone. I'd narrowly missed out on riding their original Cyclone roller coaster, as it was closed during my first visit to the park, but that roller coaster had now been transformed into Wicked Cyclone, and that transformation had created an amazing ride. If there's a single word to describe Wicked Cyclone, it's aggressive, and it feels like RMC really perfected their craft here and made an absolute monster of a coaster. It's packed with ejector airtime and insane twists and turns, and the ride's got a good length to it as well, giving a really satisfying ride overall. It really makes the most out of the space available to it, and despite only being a little over 100 feet tall, it punches well above its weight. Unusually for a Six Flags park, they also decided to try and theme the ride, and there's a few interesting props from a weather monitoring team strewn around the site. It's a nice touch and quite rare to see in an American park. The first year I rode Wicked Cyclone, it was seriously hauling and felt incredibly fast, delivering strong ejector air for the whole ride. It was so impressive that it made it really difficult to pick between it and Iron Rattler as to which was my favourite RMC. Strangely, however, in subsequent years that I've visited the park, it's never quite seemed to reach those same heights and thrills as my first visit. I'm not sure if I've just been unlucky and caught it on off days since then, and to be fair, my most recent visit to the park was on a kind of cold and rainy day, so it wouldn't have been running at its best, but it just didn't seem to have quite the same level of aggression and insanity as before. Still, it's a great ride either way, and even when it's running slightly slow, it's still absolutely phenomenal. Later that same year, RMC would open its first ever roller coaster in Europe, so naturally I had to visit, and in early autumn I found myself at Kolmården Zoo in Sweden to ride the one and only Wildfire. Wildfire would be my third RMC wooden coaster, and as the first ever RMC to be built in Europe, it was a pretty big deal. It almost came out of nowhere, as I hadn't even heard of Kolmården Zoo until they made this crazy announcement that they were building one of the tallest wooden roller coasters in the world. The park had actually built a couple of coasters prior to Wildfire, but these were both small family coasters that I had little interest in riding, so Wildfire would be a complete game changer for the park. Wildfire almost seems like it was out of place, but somehow it fits in brilliantly, and the way it's nestled in amongst the trees and how it utilises the natural terrain in its layout, it's almost as if it's camouflaged to some extent. As for the ride itself, Wildfire is a brilliant coaster, but with a slight caveat that once again I don't think it's a brilliant wooden coaster. Just like Outlaw Run and Goliath, when I rode it, it lacked that wooden coaster feeling and vitality, and felt like I was riding a hybrid instead. It's nonetheless great fun to ride, the inversions are amazing and the airtime is great, but it just doesn't feel like a wooden coaster should. It's still great fun though, and it has some spectacular moments, such as the first drop that leads into a glorious zero-G stall. It also features all the typical RMC elements that fans love too, and for the most part it's got great pacing. There was one other slight niggle I had though, as when I rode it I felt the pacing seemed to fizzle out towards the end, and despite a really strong start it turns into a bit of a damp squib at that point. It's a shame that the ending is a bit on the weak side, as the rest of the ride is really rather excellent. I'm probably sounding like I'm being overly critical of Wildfire, but I honestly do enjoy it and it's a pleasure to ride. It's just a shame that it simply doesn't have that essence and heart of a wooden coaster. It's been quite a long time since I rode it though, so maybe it's matured with age, and I'd love to go back and ride it again this year if possible. There's added incentive to do this, as Gronaland, another park in Sweden, is set to open a new B&M inverted coaster, and I've discovered that one of Alton Tower's most beloved former coasters, that I've never had the chance to ride, the Black Hole, is currently operating at another zoo in Sweden, and that's a coaster I'd love to add to my list. Unfortunately, not every one of my trips in 2016 was successful in riding RMCs, as during October I would make another big trip to the United States with a friend from Germany, and the last park on our list was Dollywood, where we were both hoping to ride the brand new Lightning Rod, RMC's newest, fastest and sadly least reliable coaster. After a delayed opening, the ride had seemingly been running on a very intermittent basis, but I had been keeping a close eye on it, and the weekend before we went, I'd heard reports that it was running for most of the day. Unfortunately, this would end up being one of my biggest spites, and despite every other coaster at the park running perfectly well, there were no signs of life at all in Lightning Rod, and it remained closed for the whole day. This is of course one of the risks of being a roller coaster enthusiast. You can never guarantee a ride you're hyped for will be open, but this one stung quite a lot, as my German friend specifically loved launch coasters, and she had already been spited by King Dakar on the same trip. The trip to the USA I made earlier in the year had originally planned to include Dollywood as well, but I modified it to visit Silver Dollar City instead after the original opening date for Lightning Rod was delayed. It would be another 3 years before I'd have a chance to ride Lightning Rod again, but in that time there would be plenty of other coasters to visit. Strangely, in 2017, I don't think I rode a single new RMC, but nonetheless had some amazing trips. Most of these were based around Europe, but I did have one large USA trip which took me to several new parks as well as revisiting some old favourites, so I got to re-ride Goliath at Six Flags Great America again, and I also visited Cedar Point, where I saw the beginnings of one of RMC's largest ever projects, as their huge wooden coaster Mean Streak began to receive its conversion into Steel Vengeance. 2018, however, would be one of the greatest years for RMC, as they not only debuted their first single-rail Raptor coasters, but they also opened 2 new hybrids in America, Twisted Timbers and, of course, Steel Vengeance. I was lucky enough to ride both of these coasters in their opening year, and on the same trip as well, although organising that trip had taken quite a lot of effort. We started out making our way down the east coast of America, stopping off at Busch Gardens before making our way to King's Dominion, home to at that time my number 1 coaster, Intimidator 305. I made sure to get plenty of re-rides on that fantastic Giga coaster, but the new attraction that year was of course Twisted Timbers. This was actually a conversion of the old Hurler wooden coaster, and once again RMC made a brilliant ride. This would also be my first time experiencing a new element in the form of a barrel roll down drop, and it felt great. You get some really nice air in that drop as you're spun head over heels, and it's a fantastic way to start off the coaster. After that drop, you've got a small airtime bump before an overbanked turnaround, and then you're greeted by 3 amazing back-to-back sustained ejector airtime hills. This first part of the ride is simply amazing, and I love the sustained forces you get in those hills. They really send you flying, and you can't help but throw your arms up in the air as you race over them. Unfortunately, the rest of the ride just isn't as good as that first half, and what follows are several rather jerky transitions and jolts of airtime where you're rapidly bounced up and down or side to side, and to me those bits just aren't as fun as the big sustained elements. I know some people love small pops of air like that and getting slammed around, but it's really not for me. There's some good bits in the second half of the ride, such as a low to the ground 0G roll, but the jerky bits really detract from it, and it kind of feels like RMC were just trying to make something different for the sake of being different, rather than for the sake of making a better coaster. Give me big elements with sustained forces any day, rather than these violent jerky sections. This was something that I again noticed on the next new RMC on that trip, the legendary Steel Vengeance. Steel Vengeance is an undeniably impressive coaster, and at the time it opened it was the tallest, steepest, longest and fastest RMC hybrid coaster in the world. When I first rode it, I was certainly impressed, but there's just so much going on in the ride that it can be a bit overwhelming to try and unpack it all and realise just what you've experienced when riding it. It feels truly relentless, and there's many bits of the ride that I love. It's got a great first drop, and the first huge elements give amazing air, but unlike other enthusiasts I know, I don't think it's beyond criticism, and I don't think it's the 100% perfect coaster that others make it out to be. Some of the transitions and bumps toward the end suffer from the same problems I found with Twisted Timbers, in that they just get a bit jerky and awkward, and only offer very brief bits of air before you're slammed back into your seat. I'd rather have one large hill than 4 tiny bunny hops that bounce you up and down, but Steel Vengeance seems to be designed more around quantity of airtime moments rather than their quality. It won't surprise me if there's a lot of comments on this video about me being wrong about Steel Vengeance, as when I dared to give it any criticism in a previous video, its fans were certainly vocal. Different people like different things though, and Steel Vengeance may be the perfect coaster for you, but my idea of the ultimate roller coaster is something different, as you'll find out a little later in this video. A lot of people I know absolutely adore Steel Vengeance and have it as their personal number 1 coaster, but for me it still didn't come close to beating Intimidator 305 as my personal number 1. It's possible I'd overhyped it to myself, as there was certainly a lot of buzz about the coaster when it opened, or perhaps I've caught it on days when it wasn't running at its best, but for me Steel Vengeance is a good, but not life-changing coaster. My next trip to America in 2018 would take me back to the West Coast, and for the first time I'd be visiting parks around San Francisco, in particular Six Flags Discovery Kingdom and California's Great America, both of which had RMCs that I was yet to ride. The first of these was Joker at Six Flags Discovery Kingdom, which is an RMC hybrid conversion of the old wooden coaster Roar. Now the Joker's a really fun coaster, and if it's the only RMC coaster you've ridden, I'm sure you'll love it, but for me, I think this may be the least memorable of all the RMCs. The problem is it just doesn't have any particular standout moments in comparison to the rest, and it almost seems like RMC didn't put as much effort or creativity into designing it as the others. Apart from the first step-up underflip element, it seems like every other part of the ride had already been done better by other coasters, and there's not really anything unique about their setting or how they're done here. The only thing that makes this ride stand out is the colour of its track, which I'll admit does look good, but as for the rest of it, it seems like this is as generic as an RMC can be. It's almost as if it lacks that special spark of inspiration you get on their other rides. That's not to say it's a bad ride in any way, but there's just so many better RMC coasters out there that this one almost just fades into the background. Railblazer at California's Great America, on the other hand, was something very different and unique for me. This would be the first time I experienced one of RMC's single-rail Raptor coasters, and what an experience it was. This thing is simply insane. It may have an incredibly compact layout, but the train just tears around the track and through transitions at a rate that seems unbelievably fast. If you see video of this ride, you may even think that it's been sped up, but after seeing and riding it in person, I can confirm that the ride really is that fast. Watching it, it may even look like some of the transitions and elements would be uncomfortable, but amazingly, that isn't the case, and the ride just flies through all these twists and turns of the track and feels amazing. I think the secret to this is that the trains only hold a single person in each car, so you only have one heartline to consider when going through all these elements and transitions. This means that the ride can pull off rapid twists around a single axis and still feel comfortable. The ride is short but very, very sweet to ride, and I can't wait to see what RMC create with this single rail design in the future. I'd like to add a little caveat here to my claim of riding every RMC model that's currently open, in that to date this is still the only single rail coaster I've ridden. There's another one at Six Flags Fiesta Texas called Wonder Woman, but it's the exact same layout as this one, and this one has better theming, so I doubt the experience of riding it would be any better than Railblazer, but for honesty's sake I thought I'd mention that here. As part of the same 2018 trip, I'd revisit Twisted Colossus for more RMC thrills, but it wouldn't be until the next year that I would finally tick off every RMC on my list. 2019 would be another great year for me riding RMCs, and this would be a year where I'd have several large trips that took me all around the world. RMC's creations had finally appeared outside of America, and it was time for me to pay them a visit, starting off in May with a trip to Mexico to ride Medusa Steel Coaster. Despite this being the first time I'd ride an RMC hybrid coaster outside of the United States, Medusa was actually only the third hybrid coaster that RMC had built, and it opened way back in 2014. In spite of that, I think it's one of their best to date.
Probably one of, if not the best RMC coaster in the world. It's got amazing pacing, there's not a dull moment in it at all. The pacing is just phenomenal, it's just one element after another, no letdown, no respite, boom boom boom, it's just such a fantastic coaster.
There's so much to love about Medusa. Just like Twisted Timbers, it's got a barrel roll down drop, but after that the ride just flows into amazing element after amazing element, and the way it transitions from one section to the next is just so incredibly silky smooth. It's completely packed with quality airtime as well, and there's none of those small jerky elements you get in other RMCs. Instead, every element on the ride is taken with purpose, and you get so much fantastic airtime. It's all killer and no filler. Medusa is simply a wonderful ride. The rest of my Mexico trip was fantastic as well, and along with the classic Schwarzkopfs that I found there, Medusa was a real highlight. I absolutely loved riding it, and I might have even considered it my favourite RMC if it wasn't for the next one that I would ride just 2 months later. The next step of my journey to ride every RMC would probably be the most significant one, as this would take me to the other side of the world, to Hakuge at Nagashima Spa Land in Japan. Through a bit of randomness on this trip, I was being followed by a Japanese film crew for a reality TV show, and I was also joined by my good friend Serena from Coaster Force. This meant that I could use some of their equipment to film on rides, and resulted in this video of my very first ride on Hakuge. Hakuge simply blew me away with how good it was. I was expecting it to be good, but it exceeded those expectations by miles. Perhaps those expectations had been tempered by a relatively slow-looking POV that had been released before, but once I was riding it, wow, it was just so amazingly good. The sustained forces on the elements, the flow from one section to another, the pacing, the smoothness, everything about this coaster was amazing. After a couple of rides, I was certain that this was my new #1 coaster, displacing Intimidator 305 from the top spot, and this would be the new standard by which I'd judge all other rides.
So today we've been at Nagashima Spa Land having an absolutely phenomenal day. I've just been riding Hakuge behind me, and it's absolutely amazing. There's so much airtime, it's like the double up, which is just going up just now. I just rode it in the front, and holy it is stunning.
It's crazy, the amount of airtime on the double up, like...
And it's just really strong.
Yeah, it's like being punched out of your seat, like, oh, crazy.
The inversions are awesome as well. There's like a really long 0G stall, and this incredibly smooth, what would you call it even?
It's a 0G roll, apparently, according to RCD.
You've tuned it up.
Yeah, it's got a 0G stall and 2 0G rolls. But they look more like a kind of...
Was 1G?
Yeah.
Roll, like normal gravity roll?
Yeah, it's very strange, but that's actually my favourite part of the ride. You do this incredibly smooth 0G roll, you get so much airtime when you come out of it.
Yeah.
And then you go into a massive airtime hill, and it's just breathtaking.
There's just so many good things in it. I mean, the weird sideways wave turn bit after the double up.
The sideways airtime is also really intense, and the first drop in the back row. I mean, I was just...
That was like, I must go, my planet needs me.
I was like, oh my god, it's like crazy good.
I mean, we were saying, the drop compares favourably with El Toro.
Yes.
Like, it's the same sort of kind of drop, because you're going around a corner at speed, and then you're just like, whoa!
Yeah, you already picked up quite a lot of speed before you even go into the drop, so it probably like boots you over the drop.
Yeah.
It is sensational, it's such a good coaster.
I managed to have about 5 rides in total, and that included both the front and back seats, but in truth, every seat I rode in on this coaster was absolutely amazing. It's exactly what I want in a coaster: big, powerful elements with sustained forces, a mixture of positive, negative and zero G, smoothness, and that all-important pacing which means the ride never has a dull moment. Hakuge is the best coaster ever made by RMC, and in my opinion, the best coaster in the world. There was still a handful of other RMC coasters I hadn't ridden though, and so later that summer, as part of a large trip around the United States that included revisiting Steel Vengeance and Goliath again, I made a stop off at Kentucky Kingdom for their very fun RMC hybrid coaster, Storm Chaser. This is one of the smaller RMCs, but boy does it pack a punch. Just like Medusa and Twisted Timbers, it starts out with a twisting barrel roll drop, and after that you hit with a near relentless barrage of strong ejector airtime over every one of its elements. It's quite a short ride, especially when you consider it was converted from Twisted Twins, a dueling coaster which had a combined track length over double of what Storm Chaser is now, but in a way that's just as well, as the intensity of the airtime on some sections of this coaster is so strong that if it were any longer you may struggle to re-ride it, as you're already almost guaranteed to walk away with some airtime bruises from how intense it is now. If you like your rides intense though, you'll probably love Storm Chaser, but it would be difficult to ride it all day. The next step of my journey to ride every RMC was a slightly shorter one for me, because after a long time, Europe had finally received its first RMC hybrid coaster conversion, Untamed at Wallaby, Holland. Untamed replaced the old Vekoma wooden coaster Robin Hood, and it was quite a big upgrade. I'd kind of hoped they'd follow the naming convention of Twisted Colossus, Twisted Cyclone and Twisted Timbers, and call this one Twist Coaster Robin, but instead they called it Untamed, and I'll admit that's probably a better name for a coaster. Its layout is particularly interesting, as most RMC conversions are of a Twister or Cyclone type layout, but this one's more of an out and back layout, and so it's got more straight track sections for them to work with. My favourite part of the ride though has to be the first large element after the drop, described as a 270-degree double inverting stall. This gives an amazing sensation that's like a hybrid of a wave turn and a zero G stall, and it's silky smooth while it inverts you twice, making this the RMC coaster with the most inversions, with a grand total of 5. It's amazing how RMC keep innovating with new elements like this one, and I hope to see similar parts on other coasters in the future. The ride is packed with airtime, and when it's fully warmed up, every one of the hills gives amazing ejector airtime. It can be quite interesting to ride this coaster when it's not fully warmed up though, as I found it gave a very fun and floaty ride when it was first thing in the morning, which is a sharp contrast to the more aggressive ride you get later in the day. Untamed will hopefully light the way for other older wooden coasters in Europe to receive the RMC treatment, as there's several decent candidates that would benefit greatly from it. RMC were about to prove that they didn't need an old wooden coaster skeleton to build a hybrid coaster though, as the next RMC I was to visit was another one in Europe, and a rather spectacular one at that, Zadra at Energylandia. Zadra is an amazing coaster, and one that's surprising for several reasons. For a start, it wasn't even supposed to open in 2019, having been expected to debut in 2020 instead. The ride even partially collapsed in a storm during construction, but somehow the Polish builders managed to complete the ride way ahead of schedule, and it opened in late August. It was the first RMC hybrid coaster to be built from the ground up, and it also broke Steel Vengeance's records as the tallest and fastest one. Whilst Energylandia's marketing have insisted on calling it a wooden coaster, it is actually a hybrid, and a brilliant one at that.
Zadra is a pretty awesome coaster. I'd say out of the rides I've had, it's been better towards the front. The back seat is a more of a floater sort of style to it, whereas the front's got much snappier transitions and much stronger G-force as well. You get more ejector air at the front than the back.
Its first drop is very similar to Steel Vengeance's, but its overall layout is much shorter, and it's entirely filled with large elements that give sustained forces that I love. One incredible moment is its zero-G stall, which I'm pretty certain is the largest element of its kind in the world, although the one on Wildfire is probably a close second. This has you hanging upside down whilst weightless for an insanely long time, and it's a real highlight of the ride. The rest of the layout has some large airtime hills, wave turns, and a couple more inversions, and similar to Medusa, it's an all-killer, no-filler sort of coaster. If I had a criticism, it's that it ends a bit too soon and too suddenly, as you end up slamming into the brakes really hard, and it feels like the track length could have been a bit longer, but it still gives a really satisfying ride. The ride also feels even faster at night in the dark, and was something spectacular to experience.
So just had a backseat night ride on Zadra, which was pretty immense. It looks absolutely phenomenal at night, this coaster. The way you're diving through all the woodwork as well, it just looks stunning.
As good as it was, it still didn't quite top Hakuge for me, but Zadra is definitely one of the top tier RMCs. After visiting all of their coasters outside of the United States in 2019, my journey to riding every one of RMC's coasters was finally nearing its end. There remained just 2 coasters that eluded me, a single hybrid coaster, Twisted Cyclone at Six Flags Over Georgia, and the wooden coaster that had spited me several years back, Lightning Rod at Dollywood. Fortunately, those 2 parks were less than 4 hours drive away from each other, and so in October 2019, I made my way back to America to tick off those final 2 RMCs. Twisted Cyclone was the first, and it's a great ride.
So I've just ridden Twisted Cyclone in the front seat, and it's an awesome coaster. The airtime is incredibly intense. So the airtime's really strong, the inversions are really smooth, really good fun. It's an awesome coaster.
Twisted Cyclone is currently the most recent RMC hybrid conversion to open in the United States, and it once again shows off RMC's creativity. It may have the shortest length of all their hybrid coasters, but it's got plenty of ingenuity and features 2 elements I'm particularly keen on. One is a reverse cobra roll, which combines 2 delightfully floaty inversions and a turnaround, and the other is this kind of crazy overbanked wave turn.
It's got this really quite interesting element behind me here, which is kind of like a sideways airtime hill, except it somehow breaks physics, I think. You get like ejector air, but like in the same vertical plane as your body. It's hard to explain, but basically you're tilted on your side, and then you're sort of given ejector air time in that same angle. It's it's one of those weird RMC elements that just are great fun.
I had a blast riding Twisted Cyclone, and if I'm honest, there's only really one thing I dislike about it, and that's its name. I keep getting mixed up with Wicked Cyclone, and similarly named coasters like Twisted Timbers, Wicked Twister, and Twisted Colossus don't really help. It was still a landmark coaster for me though, and riding it meant that I'd now completed the full set of RMC hybrid coasters. That just left the elusive wooden coaster Lightning Rod to fully complete my RMC list, and so after ensuring to get some fantastic night rides on Twisted Cyclone, I started to make my way to Pigeon Forge and Dollywood. There was no way I would allow Lightning Rod to elude me this time, and whilst I'd heard it supposedly become more reliable, I left nothing to chance, and planned for 2 days at the park with a day in between to explore the region's alpine coasters. Thankfully, the coaster gods smiled upon me, and for my first day at the park, it was beautiful sunshine, and I had many rides on Lightning Rod.
So just finished the first of my days this year at Dollywood. It's been pretty amazing. Lightning Rod has been fantastic. I'm so glad I got to do it after being spited several times in the past. And at night, it is a phenomenal coaster. Just the launch was actually much better than I expected. I was expecting something similar to Mac launches, but this actually got a pretty good kick to it. And then after that, at night, you dive into this valley, and you virtually can't see a thing. It's absolutely amazing, just feels so fast in the dark. And I get to come back in a couple of days and do it again.
Unfortunately, when I came back to do the bulk of my filming, the weather had changed quite drastically and it rained for most of the day. This meant that Lightning Rod wasn't quite as fun, as having rain pelt you in the face at 73 miles an hour is kind of uncomfortable. It's also quite tricky to film Lightning Rod in the first place, as the bulk of the ride is actually hidden in a valley which you can't actually see from anywhere in the park, and only the launch, quad down, and final turnaround are visible. Lightning Rod is unique amongst RMCs, as to date it's the only one to ever feature a launch, and it's an uphill launch at that.
So thankfully there's been a bit of a respite in the rain, and it stopped, so I've had a bunch of rides on Lightning Rod again. It's a phenomenal coaster. One thing that really surprised me is the launch is much more forceful than I was expecting. I was expecting something similar to like a Mac launch, but it's actually got a pretty good kick to it. After that, first drop's awesome. The pull out from the first drop's actually got a fair bit of G-force to it, so I was getting a little bit of grey out on that. After that, you've got some fun twists with sideways airtime, and then the way back towards the station, you just have all these airtime hills that are just one after another after another after another. They're short, but they give really powerful airtime. It's an awesome coaster.
There's something else uniquely special to Lightning Rod too, in my opinion. Unlike any of the other RMC wooden coasters, Lightning Rod still somehow manages to maintain that essence and feel of a real wooden coaster. The track's got a bit more flex to it, it's not super silky smooth, and it has that wooden, out-of-control aggression that you just don't get on the other RMC coasters. It's hard to describe, but when I rode Lightning Rod, it genuinely felt like a wooden coaster and not a hybrid. But sadly, the next people that ride it will no longer get that experience. Lightning Rod will be the first RMC wooden coaster to get converted into a hybrid, or at least parts of it will. As I've alluded to in this video regarding the delayed opening and reliability problems it had, Dollywood had seemingly decided that the best way to fix these problems is to replace the wooden track with steel iBox track. The layout will remain the same, but I suspect it will almost certainly lose that wooden coaster feeling, which is quite sad. Lightning Rod was the fastest wooden coaster in the world, and it will also lose that record again to Goliath. I still expect it will be a fun ride, but it will no longer have that special wooden feel to it that made it all that more special. Riding Lightning Rod at the end of 2019 meant I could finally claim to have ridden every unique RMC coaster design, and it's a milestone I'm pretty proud of. I do wonder how many other people can claim to have done the same, as I know 2020 threw a spanner in the works for several people that would have otherwise managed the same achievement. My journey had taken me 5 years and spanned the world, and along it I discovered some truly amazing coasters, including to this day my personal #1 coaster, Hakuge. Hopefully I'll be able to add the new RMCs that are set to open in 2021 to my list, but the future of this year is still a massive question mark. I can't wait to ride Iron Gwazi and Jersey Devil, as well as whatever RMC come up with in the future, but at this point I'd be pretty happy to ride just about any coaster, or have some idea when travelling will become possible again. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like and comment to let me know which RMC is your favourite and which you'd most like to ride. And if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to see how this journey continues, if and when I finally get to ride the new RMCs. I've been Rollercoaster David, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again in another video very soon.